Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. We welcome back today Dennis Hirsch. He's a healthcare attorney. His Kevin MD article, which we'll talk about today, is What Happens If I Don't Give the Notice Required Under My Physician Employment Agreement. Dennis, welcome back to the show.
No, thanks. It's good to be here.
So Dennis has been on many times talking about physician employment contracts. Go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Upper right-hand corner, there's a search icon. Click on that for Dennis's past shows. So today we're going to talk about giving notice under the physician employment agreement. Now, tell us how your article came together.
Well, it seems like I've had a rash of these recently, and I think because as staffing gets worse, hospitals in particular are just pushing physicians harder. And I've had a lot of physicians who just said, I've had it. I've got to get out of here. I just looked at my contract and it says I have to give 90 days notice, but I hate it here. I'm ready to go someplace else. And I looked all through the contract and there's nothing in it that says I can't just leave earlier. It doesn't give the employer any penalty that if I leave early. So I assume that means I can just leave whenever I want and nothing will happen to me. And as I said, that's not, I usually have to kind of give some bad news to the physician then that no, that's not really the case.
So in many cases, what exactly do most physician employments say when it comes to leaving the practice?
Most of them don't. They'll have a without cause termination that says you give 90 days notice, for example. I mean, I always shoot for more to give the physician time for credentialing and everything, but most of them say you can, either party can terminate on, let's say, 90 days notice. And that's it. It doesn't say anything. And if you don't give 90 days notice, then this happens.
All right. So in many cases, if a physician just wants to walk up and leave, you advise them not to do that. Why should they not do that?
Well, you're breaching your contract. And when you breach your contract, there's all kinds of bad results flow from that. The first thing is the employer may be able to get money damages from you. So if you have patients scheduled for the next 80 days and you're not going to be there for at least some period of time, they may very well go out and hire a locum tenens company to cover. And a lot of physicians say, well, locum tenens physicians don't get paid that much. That's true, but the locum tenens companies do get paid a lot. So the difference between what they're paying a locum tenens company and what they were paying you can be fairly substantial. Other bad things come from it. You probably know if you're going for credentialing, they need to say that you were perhaps the finest physician that ever walked on the face of the earth. If somebody says, oh, he's an average physician, that means that's definitely a red flag. So when they're contacted for credentialing, it's very easy for them to torpedo a credentialing. And again, by not saying anything bad, just being neutral. He's an average physician. We didn't have any serious problems with him. And, you know, for most employees, that would be a fine recommendation. For a physician, that's a death sentence.
Now, have you seen cases where employers actually went after physicians monetarily because they breached their contract and left early?
I actually haven't. I've had one where they threatened it, but they didn't actually do it. I mean, a lawsuit is expensive for both parties, and they're not as likely to do it. And also, if you're a hospital and you've got a couple of hundred employed physicians, it really doesn't do you a lot of good for your physician relationship if you go after a physician, even if that physician was in the wrong. You know, I think there are some that do what they call interim, same as the IRS will go after the grandma who didn't report, you know, the $10 she got in the lottery or something. They don't so much do it for the money as so that people read about it and say, oh, if they went after her, they're definitely going to come after me. So I think there's a risk of that. I have not actually been involved in any monetary damage cases, though. They've usually backed off.
So let's talk about the mechanics of actually leaving a physician job. So many different ways to do it: in person, email, letter, how much to write. Just from your experience, what is the proper way or the recommended way a physician should leave their job?
Well, first follow the contract. So if it says certified mail return receipt requested to this address with a copy to this address, do that. then usually to keep relationships good, I usually recommend you go to the chief of the department or
Mhm.
whatever and say, hey, my contract said I had to do this, so you'll be getting this letter, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that I'm resigning. As far as a resignation letter, I usually, if you can do one sentence, that's great. I usually say something like, I hereby resign pursuant to Section 8A of my employment agreement, and maybe say something, I appreciate the opportunity to serve patients in your fine institution or something like that. But a lot of times people will say, oh, I've got these 27 beefs against them, and I'm going to write this 50-page letter that lays out in details ever since the last 3 years, all the things they've done and the staffing. And I don't recommend doing that, because if you think about it, if I mailed you a letter and said, you are a bad physician, you're not going to go, okay. You are absolutely going to respond to that, and now we're going to get into a back and forth, and there's just no benefit to that. You have the right to leave without cause. Just say, I'm exercising my rights. Thanks for the opportunity. And don't go into anything else.
So let's say you give that notice to your employer. What normally happens next?
Usually, well, it depends. As things get tighter and the physician shortage gets worse, a lot of times people are still being scheduled. As recently as 3 years ago, it wasn't common that they would say thanks, and a lot of contracts have the option for them to say, don't come in Monday. We're going to pay you for the notice period, but we don't want you in here. That used to be common. I'm seeing it less and less now, and I think just the staff is pushed so hard. I just don't think they're able anymore to push them anymore. But it still isn't rare that they'll say, thanks, don't come in. Monday's your last day and we're going to pay you. Have a nice life. Because really, nobody wants a physician that doesn't want to be there in general.
Do you see cases where employers may meet with that physician to perhaps work out some of their differences and try to retain that physician after notice has been given?
I've never seen that. I've had one where the physician said, look, I got a much better deal across town, and the covenant not to compete. And I've had one case where they came in and said, we'll match that salary. But other than that, no, generally when somebody says they're leaving, the employer just says, okay, that's the way it is.
Now, I've heard some anecdotes that during that 90-day period after a physician gives notice, the employer can make life miserable for that physician. And this is just through the grapevine. Are
Yeah.
stories like that true? And if so, what can that physician do to protect themselves against something like that?
Not a lot. I've had it happen just a few times. I wouldn't say it's common. Anecdotally, I've had one or two where they started scheduling a lot more. They started overbooking the physician and a few things, but really that's unusual. Generally, the physician just works whatever, and there's nothing that, no problems. All you can do is, you're following the contract, you can insist that the employer follows the contract too. So if there's a patient contact hour limitation, you should insist on that and say, look, you're scheduling me more than my contract requires. If the contract says call coverage will be equitably allocated, you can't be giving me more call coverage. So you can push back. And at some point, I think you are in a better position now than normally, because they know you're leaving. If you say, look, that breaches my contract, if you don't fix that, I'm leaving. It's a lot. For you to do that to your employer, it's kind of a scary, it's sort of, I've got a hand grenade here and I'm going to drop it between us if you don't comply. But if you've already given notice, we presume you've got your new position in place, and it's a pretty backed up threat.
So let's say a physician comes to you for advice and they're perhaps in that gray area where they're not happy with their job, but they're not sure whether they want to leave or not. Now, what kind of questions would you ask that physician to determine whether they want to take that final step and actually leave their position versus staying, maybe work out some of the differences?
Well, I think it depends. Do you have another offer? Have you looked around? I mean, is the pay comparable? Are the hours comparable? Are the working conditions comparable? I mean, you shouldn't just say, I don't like it here, I'm sure any place in the world is better. you should be looking around, seeing what other places are offering and talking to other places and see, how much call do you have? What's your patient contact hours like? What's it like working there? What's the staff like? So I wouldn't just say it's bad here, it's got to be better any place in the world. Look around. And if you look around, you're really not happy, and someplace appears to be better, and you've checked it out on RYHE and all the .org and all the places where you can check up on an employer, then I'd say start pursuing that opportunity and at least seeing if the grass really is greener. But like I said, there's no perfect job. So the fact that you're not happy where you are, I don't think is reason by itself to just not to leave.
In general, should physicians have another job in hand before they give notice to their current job?
It's funny. I have a lot that don't. I personally, if I didn't know where my income was coming from in 90 days, I can't imagine me saying I quit and I'm sure I'll find something. Yeah, a physician will find something. There's no doubt about that. I think it's a matter of personal risk tolerance. I can't recommend to somebody, but just quit and I'm sure you'll find a position. But I've had lots of clients that do it. They know there's a shortage. They know people are out there screaming for more physicians, and I've had people do it, but I just can't recommend it myself.
One of the things they mentioned earlier was credentialing. You'll need a good word from the employer that you're leaving. Is there any way to guarantee that good word, or is there any way to get assurances that that recommendation would be positive if you leave amicably?
Oh yeah, at times I've even asked to say, can we work out the letter that you send somebody? If things are amicable, there's probably not a reason that they're going to say anything negative. The concern is going to be, and honestly, it would give you pause as a new employer if you said, yeah, he has a 90-day notice and he left after, he gave us 10 days and left. I think if you were a new employer, just that fact, which is absolutely true, I think would give you pause, about hiring that physician.
We're again talking to Dennis Hirsch. He's a physician employment lawyer. His Kevin MD article that we'll talk about today is what happens if I don't give the notice required under my physician employment agreement. Dennis, tell us again some take-home messages as it relates to early termination and your Kevin MD article.
Well, I think one of the biggest things is remember the attorney's golden rule, and that's different than most people's. For attorneys, the golden rule is he who has the gold rules. And if you're leaving and breaching an employment agreement, the fact that your employer owes you money, they owe you money under an agreement that you breached. They may not pay it. They may have an agreement to pay your tail if you leave. And again, if you've breached the agreement, they may not do it. So be aware that you can't look at your contract and say, whatever I'm entitled to under the contract, I'm sure I'll get that if I leave. The other thing is, if you can, I always try and recommend you just stick it out. The downsides are so big. The potential for a credentialing call to go sideways is, it's two physicians talking to each other on the phone. If one just kind of goes, well, how is he as a physician? Well, that could be bad enough. So I usually say, if you possibly can, without losing your mind, try and stick it out through the notice period.
Dennis, thanks once again for sharing your advice and insight, and thanks again for coming back on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure.